Gates Thomas. Thank you. I chose the title Hamburg, inspired, of course, by the city of Hamburg, which is probably Germany's most musical city, and also in honor of the neighborhood that Davenport's Germans founded just up the hill. They were really trying to replicate the cultural institutions and systems that they knew at home and missed. And we are the beneficiaries of that, and I hope that this presentation will give you some clear ideas how. I'm keeping three big themes in mind. The first is that if you came to Davenport in the 1850s, unless you were independently wealthy, if you were a member of the French family, for example, and you already had wealth, except for the very elite, anybody else had to learn how to care for a horse. Anybody else had to learn how to grow at least some of their own food. Maybe they had a garden, maybe they had a hog. Everybody had to learn to do some kind of manual labor just to survive that first winter. This kind of plays into the second theme, which is that musicians move all through society. We meet and encounter every kind of human being that there is, you know. It's one of the strange things, it's one of the delightful things about being a musician, is it brings you into contact with so many different kinds of people. Because of that, you tend to move through different social classes and your own class identity as a musician. You are thought of as a musician, which is separate from other classes, but you also kind of move. It's really ambiguous what social class a musician belongs to. Perfect example, Davenport's leading musician from the 1850s was a pianist, piano teacher, and cellist named Hugo Braunlich. Hugo Braunlich was the son of a doctor who treated royal people in insane asylums, and there were surprisingly quite a few of these. He grew up in this very refined environment. He probably heard Franz Liszt play more than once, and this is when Liszt was in his prime. Hugo Braunlich was an extraordinary musician, but he also studied forestry, and when he came here, he had to have some way to supplement his income, so he became a landscape gardener. And most of the finest old houses in Davenport, if they still have the original landscaping, it was probably Hugo Braunlich who did it. My third theme is that Davenporters, for most of our history, made music with each other, for other Davenporters. Music really is an expression of community and social cohesion. This is kind of a spoiler to the first half of my talk, which is really about the German era here in Davenport. The founding of the Tri-City Symphony in 1916, it was the founding of it that was the triumph. The concert probably was too, but it was really the founding of the institution. And we are really fortunate that they did, because if they had waited 1 or 2 more years, the anti-German hysteria of World War I, the climate would have probably prevented this from ever happening. So we're really fortunate that they got it together when they did. This orchestra that you see here is made up of doctors and lawyers and dentists and gardeners and manual laborers. The second chair cellist, his name was Alfred C. Müller. He was a very wealthy, prominent attorney, and 3 times elected mayor of Davenport. The fascinating thing here is that this orchestra and this organization was formed when the population here was really not that big. And this begs the question, where does a symphony orchestra come from? Well, if you asked the conductor Antonia Brico, you would get a really unusual answer. When it came time for her to settle, she chose Denver. Kind of an odd choice, but I think she probably looked at the environment and said, I can build here. And she went and built stuff. And these 2 organizations, the Women's String Ensemble and the Denver Businessmen's Orchestra, These were total amateurs. This involved her going to a stockbroker and say, hey, would you be willing to learn clarinet or cello? And she's literally starting from the bottom. It took 8 years to found a community orchestra, and it took up to 15 or 20 before we start getting the Denver Symphony, the Boulder Philharmonic. Folks, this is the population of Denver at that time, all right? 10 times what there was here. An orchestra comes from the city's musical life. The orchestra is the expression of that. Well, where does that come from? The city's musical life depends on a complex ecosystem that has all of these elements that musicians need to live, work, and be inspired and do what they do. It requires both the high and the low culture. It encompasses things well beyond actual music. It just encompasses, hey, can a musician actually live here? And what we find is that Davenport's musical ecosystem, as early as the 19th century, was highly structured, highly complex, and a great place for musicians to work. Davenport's economic base in its first 20 years, as you can see, it's very basic kinds of things. The transportation is river-based. This was a tourist spot from the beginning, by the way. This was a hunting place, mostly for tourists from the south. With the coming of the railroad, we now enter a transitional period where local producers, local farmers have a much easier way to get their products to market, and so this causes a huge increase in commerce. You start to see more advanced things like gas and electric companies being built. And then after 1870, you really see the industry here maturing, geared more toward finished products. This is where you start to see things like Bettendorf Wheel Company, which became French and Het. You see the Gordon Van Tyne store, which was a kit home ordering company. You see furniture stores, you see planing mills, window sash manufacturers. Wildcat banking is gone by this time, and it's replaced by legitimate banking. And these are really the three big things. Banking, retail, and entertainment. That's what really made this area so prosperous well into the 20th century. If we start to break down the musical infrastructure into its various parts, the first part of it is just the traditions. The first piano recital was given by Matthias Rolfs. He was a 48er, but he came in 47. He wanted to be a teacher, but that just wasn't practical. There probably wasn't a need for many German-speaking teachers here in 1847. So he went into farming, and then into business, and then into government. He came here from Germany, and he lugged his pianoforte the whole way. And he set it up in his house, and he was playing one night, and he heard something outside, and he looked, and there must have been about a dozen Sauk and Meskwaki listening to this strange music that they had never heard before. And he said, "Come on in." And that was the first recital in Davenport. The very next year, Matthias Rolfs founded the Liedertafel, which was Davenport's first German singing society. And it does not exist, but its legacy certainly does. The Liedertafel was one of a wealth of musical organizations, as Sharon E. Wood wrote in her groundbreaking book. And I went and just kind of dug up all the lists of all the different civic organizations I could find. These were the ones that were in existence in the early years. After the coming of the railroad, you just see an explosion of this. Just an explosion. And these are just the music societies. These aren't even concert organizations, really, although they did put on concerts. These are some of the instrumental ensembles. Now, it's hard to track their dates and everything because bands morph, musicians go from one band to another, and so the divisions are never really clear. But we know that all of these bands did exist, at least in some of that period. The Tri-City Musical Society, the Musicians' Union, was formed here in July of 1866. For context, the New York Philharmonic was founded in 1856. I am a member of the New York American Federation of Musicians. I lived in New York for 25 years. I'm a member of Local 802. That tells you how early this chapter was. Musicians need a place to buy strings and bows and rosins and sheet music and supplies. And here is just a little snippet to show you. In 1878, Davenporters had 7 music stores to choose from and a piano factory. Musicians also need places to play. So I plotted where these things were on the map. The bigger the circle, the bigger the hall. The Bertus Opera House in the upper right, the biggest circle, that was built in 1867, and it seated at different times between 2,000 and 2,500 people in a town which had 20,000. They could seat 10% of the population. And just because of the quality of the hall, it attracted all the attention. It attracted lots of famous guest artists, everybody from Sarah Bernhardt to Mark Twain to Al Jolson. Over the course of 55 years, they all played in that particular hall. There were also lots and lots of smaller halls, lecture and meeting halls. The significance of these smaller halls could hold anywhere from 100 to 400, 500 people. They were usually used for fraternal clubs, social organizations, and that sort of thing, but all of those organizations had their own song. So before the meeting, they would sing it, and so they would have a piano or an organ. Therefore, the lecture or meeting hall could rent out their space for small concerts and recitals, and there was a very, very active scene here for that. Outdoor music venues. Now, this is only a smattering of what had to have existed. And then we also can't ignore the impact of the Bucktown Red Light District, because this was a huge economic driver, especially for musicians. Brick Monroes. It was 150 feet long. They had strings of lights. They had vines growing on trellises. They had people sitting at tables. They had a 20-piece orchestra every night of the week until 4 o'clock in the morning. If you're a musician, that's bank. The 3 time-honored means of employment for a musician: performing, writing, teaching. These are very broad categories, so performing would include things like conducting. Writing could mean composition, or it could mean music criticism, or it could mean academic writing, or journalism, anything. Teaching, this too has a really wide connotation. In the 19th century, we start to see commerce and instrument making as viable careers unto themselves. And in our century, technology has really become huge. So these are what musicians are looking for as they put together a living. And in Davenport and the Tri-Cities, these kinds of things were available to them. You can see there's a lot of room for people to work. If we look at the total infrastructure, concert halls, theaters, music stores, dance halls, transportation, and hotels, and the hotels, as you'll see, are grouped in tiers. So the best ones are in blue, and the ones that rent by the hour are in red. This area in white dotted, that's the Bucktown Red Light District. But if you look at this, you see how dense it is. This doesn't include stores, restaurants. So you're a musician, you got a gig in the morning and you got another one in the afternoon, but you got 2 hours to kill. Well, you could go shopping or you could grab some lunch because everything was really close. What we get, even though we can't actually hear the music of this period, we get a picture of a very vibrant atmosphere. Few spot profiles of some of the leading musicians. It pains me that we have no idea to really actually hear what they sounded like. Jacob Strasser gets written up a lot because he's working every single week. Either it's a concert, a theater production at the German Theater, his street band is playing at a parade, It could be that his concert band or his concert orchestra is playing at Schuetzen Park or some other venue. Mainly, he is the big organizer. Theodor Kramer was a keyboardist and conductor and teacher. Fritz Toniges, he seems to have been kind of a wanderer. He was only in Davenport for about a decade, but you can see he taught at Augustana, also served as president of the AFM. Alice Dutton is probably one of Davenport's most famous piano teachers. She grew up here, studied with Hugo Braunlich, and then went to Boston for her music studies. And eventually she returned to Davenport, but frequently returned to Boston for concerts. She had a fan base there. She continued to teach in Davenport into her 90s. And my suspicion is that there are probably plenty of piano students in Davenport whose teachers' studied with Alice Dutton. Albert Peterson was brought to Davenport as a very young child, and by the time he was about 16, joined Jacob Strasser's band, and then in 1891 he formed his own band and his own orchestra. Albert Peterson was the founding principal violist, and he played in the orchestra for 30 years. And he led his own bands and orchestras almost up until his death in 1951. His name appears constantly in the newspapers, especially in the summer for the concerts at LeClaire Park. Ernst Otto grew up in Schleswig-Holstein and seems to have had in mind the intent of moving to Davenport to enter the music business. It seems that that was his goal from his childhood, and this is what he did. And he came to Davenport, immediately made a splash directing bands. Then he himself also established his own organizations. In 1902, he became the first superintendent of music of the Davenport schools. He was the one who founded the orchestra at what is now Central High School. He founded the entire program. When he died in 1939, he was believed to have left about 50 works for band, orchestra, and other forms, but the legend has it that shortly after that, a big truck pulled up to his house right across the street from McKinley School, packed up all the scores and parts and took them away to who knows where. They just vanished. A little more on that later. For part two of the story, of course, beginning in 1917, 1918, we have the anti-German hysteria. Also, Davenport's Germans are now in about their third generation, and their connections to the old country are now becoming rather thin, and they're becoming Americanized. Even though it might not sound German to you, the German influence is there because they came from here and they came out of this culture, and this music wouldn't have been here without that foundation. The second thing to keep in mind is that suburbanization and now globalization really change the way people hear, procure, and experience music, and this becomes a factor. So does technology and electronic media. The immigration patterns on the other side of the river are very different, and when suburban car culture now makes Illinois much more accessible to people in Iowa, we start to see this is not just Davenport music, this is really now regional. And this brings to light the very different immigration patterns on the Illinois side. In Iowa, it was predominantly Germans and Anglos, with a smattering later of Irish, Chinese, African American, and Mexican. On the Illinois side, they were all different European countries. We had Bohemians, there were Belgians, there were Italians, and of course Mexicans. Most of the Mexicans settled in Silvis and East Moline. There were some who worked the onion fields that used to be on 67, or just south of Pleasant Valley. And just like in Germany, just like in America, every small town has a town band. And so these Mexican immigrants, probably many of them rail workers, founded their own band in Silvis in 1924. No recordings, but we know that they existed, and they certainly were not alone. Here are some of the music institutions which either have morphed or still survive or have been founded since our German period. The Musicians Union, Local 67. By about 10 years ago, the only contract that they had to negotiate was the Quad City Symphony. And now that the Quad City Symphony does not hire very many local musicians, there was no contract for the union to negotiate, and so the National dissolved the local chapter. In the 20th century, music is carried far and wide by broadcasting. B.J. Palmer had many, many interests and a lot of talents. One of his many talents was not just that he was interested and understood radio, but he understood how to make it commercially viable. So he went to the Crescent Macaroni and Cracker Company and sold them on the idea of, hey, if you pay for me to produce a program 1 hour a week, we'll advertise you all over half of the state of Iowa and half of the state of Illinois. Well, they went for it. An hour on the radio, you're going to need music, and that means you're going to need musicians. So they hired 11 cats, and they paid for 16 because if Eddie Anderson is playing clarinet and sax, he gets paid the guaranteed double. And the concertmaster, who already played 2 instruments, he gets a guaranteed triple for being concertmaster. So this is a 16-piece orchestra. Somebody's got to write the music. Somebody's got to run the rehearsals. Somebody's got to put this together. And Orville Foster was probably not the only music director on staff, because this is just 1 hour a week. That's got to be a tremendous amount of work. They had to have had a huge staff of people to make this work. WOC was a universal format. That means they targeted everybody. And by about the mid-1950s, they had serious competition from a new radio station that identified as a pop music format that meant rock and roll. So that was a statement because you were chasing a young audience. All these things we take for granted now. This is what radio stations do, but it was kind of new back then. I have collected about 7 or 8 station IDs that were aired on KSTT. So here they are.
KSTT, 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 Davenport, KSTT.
Keep listening to Someplace Special, KSTT.
Someplace Special, KSTT, Davenport. KSTT, Davenport. KSTT.
Well, you can probably hear some of those voices are the same voices, and I think even in different years. And that suggests to me that this was local talent. Somebody's got to sing, somebody's got to make the record. They also had drums, they also had horns. The later ones had canned drums and canned horns and synths, but somebody's got to program that. This means work for people, and this was all local. In May 1979, the radio station is sold for $2.3 million, which is, that's a lot of money. But notice, they're in Portland, Maine. So a local center of cultural cohesion is now not here anymore. And in fact, the radio station didn't last very long. They ran on fumes for about 5 years, and then they were gone. What I would like to do for this second half is just hit certain spots, events, performances, things for which I have recorded documentation, which was a real problem in the 19th century. I will start with May 23rd, 1924. Paul Whiteman had given his Experiment in Modern Music concert at Aeolian Hall in February. This was the concert that premiered Rhapsody in Blue. And of course, it was so successful that they put together a tour with George Gershwin, and they came to Davenport on May 23rd. So this would be about the 12th performance period of Rhapsody in Blue was right here at the Davenport Coliseum. And it's curious because when you look at the reviews the next day, they hardly mention Gershwin. That's because nobody knew who he was. It was Rhapsody in Blue that made his reputation. Part about Gershwin really kind of came later. 31 January 1948. The Tri-City Symphony made its first national radio broadcast on NBC. And the circle here is to underscore the local ties and the continuity of it. The principal cellist in yellow, that's Arthur Peterson, and the principal bassist on the right is Albert. Albert was your uncle, is that right? Cousin. So that just gives you an idea of the continuity. This is an Ampex 200A tape recorder. Unfortunately, it didn't debut on the market until April, which means that this concert couldn't have been recorded that way. I have been searching for a recording of this. Because tape was not available, what it means is I'm just hoping that there was a listener out there somewhere listening to the concert who had a disc recorder and recorded it off the radio. If they did, this will survive, but who knows when they might find that. Now we advance to 15 March. Tommy Dorsey got married for the third time in 1948, decided to take a whole month off and spend it at his home in Florida. Gives his band Louis Bellson and Ben Webster and Hank Jones. These are some of the most formidable players in jazz in the late 40s. He gives them the month off. So Louis Bellson says, "Hey guys, come home. Come with me to Rock Island. I'll get you a gig." So they played Al Barnes' Horseshoe Club for a month. And at some point during that month, they wandered into Intercity Recording Studios in Moline, and they cut 3 tracks. I'm not sure why they did this. There was no possibility of them releasing this because the AFM had a recording ban for almost the entire year of 1948. And maybe that's why Hank Jones and Ben Webster didn't show up, because they were so well known by that point that they might have gotten in trouble with the union. Nobody did. This never was really released. I think they were just doing it on a lark. They wanted to get practice recording in the studio, and so they just did it. They might have even kind of forgotten about it. This brings us to recording. There was quite a recording scene in the Quad Cities, and Fred Lowe Recorders was one of the big ones. Intercity Recording 3 years later became Fred Lowe, and then they moved across the river to the East Village of Davenport. Fred Lowe was a full-service recording studio. They did everything, and one of the big things in the early years was sound effects. Here on the left, you see Fred Mauk, and Lois Mauk is in the control room. He's in the studio. I believe they're trying to create the sound effect of an electrical storm, and he's using nuts and bolts and washers and some aluminum foil. This is what they did in the 40s and 50s to create these sound effects. Fred Lowe Records existed for about 25 years. They put out all kinds of stuff, including barbershop groups. They especially did like school contests, and they recorded rock bands even. Many of the Fred Lowe releases have been now digitally archived at Richardson Sloan, and at a certain point they will make this available to the general public. I know there are samples available, but this is a rich archive. And what's brilliant about it, it's not just, all really great. It's like you get a real picture of everything that's going on in this area. Buddy Holly played the Capitol Theater. This may have been the only one on the tour that technically wasn't the Winter Dance Party. This was a KSTT promotion, Concert of Stars. Seeing the progression of the tour on a map kind of tells you a lot of the whole story. Keep in mind, this is the end of January and early February. Ooh. And as they keep going, the circles it just gets wider and wider. So by the time they get to Clear Lake, you can understand why Buddy Holly wanted to take that plane to Moorhead, Minnesota, but it didn't work out too well. They hired new bands to take over, so the tour kept going, but the party was over. Our next event is in 1967 when Paulson's Dutchman appeared at a polka festival in New Ulm, Minnesota. Here's a little bit of the actual German influence. Arnie Paulson was Ken Paulson's father. His father, Emil, was also a musician, and he grew up kind of moving around Iowa, performing all the time. So Ken Paulson grew up in family bands and decided to form his own band with himself on tuba and his dad playing drums and vocals. And they went into Fredlo Records to cut a demo, and they actually pushed it on the market, and it got some sales. So here's a few clips.
Nein, nein, das kannst du nicht, wenn auch den Wunder treue Liebe verspricht. In deinen Herzen hast du von vieler Platz.
In 1970, Arnie Paulson decided he was ready to pack it in, and so at that point, Ken Paulson moved to drums, reformed the band as a sort of big band dance outfit. They continued to play through at least 2018. They worked at least a couple of nights a week. Ken Paulson also, you recall me earlier talking about social class and musicians having to work day gigs. Ken Paulson had a day gig, and it gave the Davenport Times-Democrat headline writers a ton of inspiration. When I was a kid, I would see these stories about Ken Paulson, the band leader, and Ken Paulson, the sheriff, and I didn't realize it was the same guy. There's a lot more there, and I would love to go into it more, but that's going to have to wait for another presentation. This is probably the most astonishing artifact. The fact that it's here is really something.
I just say that, yes, Dick, I must tune up my guitar. We tune up to play every song is because we really care for your ears. That's why we don't play so loud. Right. That's where I'm from, okay. Y'all be looking at it here in Davenport? Yeah, right.
Yes, which is almost 50 to you and me. This happens a lot. Scheduling in this area, you see Jimi Hendrix playing at the Call 8 to 11, and you see the West High School Band getting scheduled for a concert at the band shell at 8. If I were a West High School musician, I would have been angry. But then again, the Night People had a steady gig every Sunday night, and after the Night People, then there was another act, Soft Machine. But apparently after they were done, the owner of the Call didn't want to pay them. Things came to a head between him and Jimi Hendrix, and Hendrix said, if you don't pay them, I ain't going on. And they had to argue for quite a while. The crowd was getting a little bit restive, so probably if you were a West High School student, you still would have made it in time. Rob Doms, who is here, actually recorded that.
Yeah, we opened up the show there, and then after we got done playing up in the balcony where nobody was, I set up a recorder and the microphones and recorded it. And had I not recorded, it wouldn't exist.
It would not, and I thank you so much for doing that. Here are some other concert advertisements from that period. This is just a sampling of it. It's not the whole thing.
Given the large venue in Iowa at that time, what makes Davenport the attraction for somebody like him? Because there are a lot of other places, a lot more.
The culture, there were people, I mean, he packed the place. There were 3,500 people inside, and he didn't know about it, but obviously his people knew, hey, this is a place where you're selling records, this is a place where you can sell tickets, and he was shocked, apparently. Somewhere around the same time, if you had driven out Brady Street way beyond the edge of town, that is to say, Brady Street Stadium, Duck Creek was the far, far north end of town. There was a pizza parlor that opened up, and that was kind of an exotic thing. Ooh, some people remember this. They had live music. A few nights a week, they had ragtime music with Bob Wilson and Jim Mason as a duo, and then they also had rock and roll at other times. And I remember, as a very young kid, going there, and the atmosphere is incredible. They hired Fred Lowe Records to come in and record one of their evenings. So here's a snippet from it. You can hear the cigarette smoke on that. October 2nd, 1976 brings a performance of the last 48er. He came in 1948, the flutist Walter Heydrich from Wiesbaden. While in music school in Germany after the war, he met the Chicago-born pianist and harpsichordist Harriet Mason. They married and decided to settle here. Heydrich trained several generations of local flutists who went on to play in some of the world's greatest orchestras. This recording comes from a performance of the Friends of Chamber Music, an organization dedicated to staging chamber music recitals by local musicians for the community. For nearly all of its 4 decades in existence, the Friends of Chamber Music were led by the violinist and conductor William Henningbaum, a former concertmaster of the Tri-City Symphony. This is an excerpt from Ginastera's Impresiones de la Puna with flute and small string orchestra. The personnel listing that came with this recording was incomplete. Only the lower strings were listed, and between 2 and 4 violinists were inadvertently left off. To reconstruct who the likely players were, I consulted news articles and musicians who played on these concert series. Most likely the concertmaster was Rayburn Pierce, and the principal second was Bill Quirham. These two played regularly on Friends of Chamber Music concerts, and they would have been Henningbaum's first call. For the other 2, 3, or 4 slots, I had to speculate, and these would be the most likely people, so I called some of them up. Carol Pedigo Phoenix said, no, I was in grad school that year, so it couldn't have been me. Candy Weebner, who was originally from Davenport, she said, no, I had already settled in Iowa City at that point, so it wasn't me. So it almost has to be one of these 3 remaining players. I asked Charlie Applenapp, he said, well, it could be, I just don't remember. April 9th, 1993, James Dixon announces that he will step down as conductor of the Quad City Symphony 1 year hence. This inspired a lot of retrospectives, a lot of special articles, and he received lots of letters from musicians that he had worked with before. And I went to Iowa City last week to see an exhibit that was in the library on Dixon's career, and it was focused on conductor as builder of community, and he really took that seriously as part of his role. One of the letters Dixon received was from the violinist Nadja Salerno-Sonnenberg, who played Samuel Barber's violin concerto with the Quad City Symphony in September 1986. The Quad City Times reported that due to heavy thunderstorms, her flight to the Quad Cities was delayed by nearly 24 hours, causing her to miss the Friday rehearsals. She didn't get to play the piece with the orchestra until the dress rehearsal just a few hours before the concert. Further, in her letter, she revealed her Quad City Symphony appearance was the first time she'd ever performed the piece, and she admitted to having been extremely nervous. Your knowledge of the piece, she wrote, was absolutely complete, and your stoic confidence in not only the orchestra's ability, but mine as well, was not only welcome, but necessary. I could not have asked for a better conductor. As one who was there that night, it was an inspired performance. Her phrasing and expression were sublime. Elsewhere in the exhibit, there was a program of an all-Barber concert that James Dixon presented in Iowa City in 1957, a rather daring move at that time. Today, Samuel Barber is well known for his violin concerto, the Adagio for strings, his first 2 essays for orchestra, his vocal works and operas. But in 1957, he was mostly obscure to mainstream concertgoers. About 10 days after this concert, the composer penned Dixon a note. Dear Jimmy, I have been submerged in Vanessa ever since I left you, and only came up for air today with the music finished. Now a deep breath and on to the orchestration. Thank you so much for all your kindness to me out there and for the performances, some of them excellent. I was really touched at the undertaking and by the results. Barber was far from being the only living composer who received this treatment. James Dixon was, in every sense of the word, the composer's champion. When I was a teenager playing in the youth orchestra and ushering for Sunday matinee concerts at the Masonic Temple, it was Dixon who introduced me to the music of composers as disparate as Dvorak, Dukas, Vaughan Williams, Prokofiev, Ravel, Hinesteta, Lucas Foss, and Charles Voronin, all within a matter of 3 or 4 years, mixed in with Beethoven, Mozart, and all the standard repertoire. Balance, variety, and depth of expression were the hallmarks of Dixon's programming, while off the podium, community engagement was his gospel. This marks the end of Dixon's tenure, and from this point on, the symphony's mission really begins to change. I would like to now go back. This is a forensic reconstruction, if you will. If you recall, I talked about Ernst Otto and a big truck that came to his house after his death, collected all his scores and took them away. Well, there were about 10 or 12 of his pieces that survived. And one of them came about because the county supervisors in 1919 decided to restart a Scott County Fair, which they decided to title the Mississippi Valley Fair and Exposition. And the level of organization and money and planning that went into this is really, really incredible, the work that they did and what resulted. And they said, well, we need to commission a piece, and so when you do that, you get the best writer in town, and that would be Ernst Otto. He composed Mississippi Valley Fair and Exposition March. Well, this piece survived only in a transcription for what we might call piano three hands. That's a joke. Most pianists only have two. And the fact that the transcription is so overwritten and clumsy that way suggests to me that he wasn't really viewing this as something for people to perform. He's viewing this as a way for him to preserve his own music. I found this in Richardson Sloan. I can read music and hear it in my head. And I'm looking at this and I say, oh, all right, well, this, that's a snare drum. And this, that's a fanfare, so you're going to score that for trumpets. A few other things that I'll point out here. Yodelee, yodelee, yodelee. He's actually writing this musical figure into the tune of the A section of this march. There are just all these really clever things in here, and I finished reading the piece and I said, this thing will score itself. I should just go ahead and do it. So I did. This is a demo recording that I've synchronized using images from the fair that appeared in the newspapers at that time. Thank you all for coming. This was a real pleasure.